Welcome to another Jacobin talk. I'm going to shock you and say that I'm not Bhaskar Sankara, but I'm filling in for him. And today we're going to be talking to Alex Gourevitch, who's the author of a book about what's sometimes called labor republicanism. He's also the author of several Jacobin articles that you should check out. Including one on that's very relevant to the talk today about why Bernie used the phrase wage slavery, and we should too. He's also written more recently, directly relevant to what we're going to talk about today, an article called Our Forgotten Labor Revolution. And also, I should mention, because he has an upcoming book about the right to strike, that there's also a Jacobin article about that, a radical defense of the right to strike. But before we get to Alex's talk, I should mention a couple of events that are coming up. So on Wednesday, we're going to have a debate between Christian Parenti and Lee Phillips about nuclear energy and socialism. Nice comradely debate, I'm sure, but should be fun to watch. I'm definitely going to be interested to check that out. On Friday, Richard Seymour is going to join us to talk about the actual legacy of Winston Churchill and why he was a monster. And then for the usual weekends show on Saturday at 1, the guest is going to be Matt Karp, who's going to be talking about his indispensable recent Jacobin article about the defeat of Bernie Sanders' political revolution and what we can learn from that moving forward. But right now, we are going to hear from Alex Gourevitch about the history of the Knights of Labor and taking the kind of ideals of freedom that were fought for on the Union side of the Civil War and extending that into the workplace. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks, Kale, for having made this possible. And thanks to all of you, wherever you are tuning in. As Ben mentioned, I'm here today to talk about the Knights of Labor, and in particular to talk about not just who the Knights of Labor were, but how they managed to organize a massive radical workers movement in the name of a certain ideal of freedom, which I call labor republicanism, and we'll explain a bit later why. But before I talk about the Knights of Labor, let me say something about why I wrote the book about this book that he mentioned about them and this wider ideal of labor republicanism, and why I think it's important and interesting today to think about them. And the reason is I've always been of the view that the best arguments for left-wing political ideals come from the principle of freedom, and that the most attractive forms of socialist and communist critique and argument can trace themselves to a certain attempt to systemize and think through the idea of human freedom. And I think it was always part of the kind of natural language of the left, at least at one point in time, to understand it to be an ideology and a movement that is about human emancipation. But I think one of the kind of grand themes of the 20th century, and in particular the kind of political defeats of the left in the last half of the 20th century, was that the left kind of lost some of that connection to the ideal of freedom, and at the same time, the right was able to mobilize and develop a kind of ideological counter-revolution in which it kind of seized the language of freedom for itself. To the point where now I think a lot of people think freedom is somehow a naturally conservative idea, that its function in political discourse is to defend things like low regulation, less taxes, defend the market, private property, but that it doesn't have as big a role on the left, or that it's not sort of connected to left-wing ideas. And so I've always, in most of the writing and thinking that I do, wanted to think about and think through what it would mean for the left to reclaim freedom. And so the work I did on the Knights of Labor was part of that project. What I wanted to do was sort of not just tell a really important and interesting and not always talked about piece of radical labor history, but also show how natural it once was for the working class to articulate its demands and its arguments in the language of freedom. And in particular, why freedom was a way of uniting workers despite the many differences in religion, ethnic identity, gender, race, and so on. And I think the Knights are a particularly good example of not just when it was the case that the left sort of naturally found freedom to be the language of critique and social vision, but that it was particularly well suited to bringing together large groups of workers despite their broad diversity. So that's why I think the Knights of Labor are particularly important to us today, and I'll come back to that at the end. So what I'd like to do in the next, I guess, like 20 minutes is to first say something about just who the Knights of Labor were, what they thought, and kind of what happened to them, and then move to these ideas about freedom, and in particular this kind of Republican language that they developed their ideas in, and then show how that was rooted in a long tradition of thinking about freedom and the economy and the organization of work. Okay, so who were the Knights? Well, the Knights of Labor were founded in 1869. They were originally a secretive organization. This image is an image of some of the founders. They were a group of radical tailors in Philadelphia in 1869, and the portrait in the middle is their founding father, or whatever, Uriah Stevens. And they were formed as a secret organization because many unions at the time were secretive or semi-secretive because of the systematic persecution and repression of unions. There was violent repression, there was legal repression, employers kept blacklists, and it was incredibly difficult at this time to organize large-scale unions that were public about their activities. And the Knights of Labor originally followed that model, and they had quite obscure set of rituals and procedures for inducting people into the Knights, and this made the Knights and other unions self-limiting. Often they would organize on a kind of craft basis or ethnic basis where people already had some pre-existing ties. But the Knights, somewhat uniquely, saw that their project was to reach beyond any particular group of workers and try to unify them into a broad-based public political organization of workers. And actually their logo, or their emblem, is a perfect representation of it. I can't go through all the details, and I've actually never been able to fully figure out all the different details of the iconography of their emblem. It's very 19th century in that way. But the most important bit of it is the inscription around the circle, which says, "That is the most perfect government in which an injury to one is the concern of all." Now, the Knights were the first to really inscribe that on the banner of a major public organization of workers. And it later was slightly modified to the more famous phrase we know, which is the most famous phrase on the left of Solidarity, which is, "An injury to one is an injury to all." But because the Knights were deeply committed to the idea that they were trying to organize all workers, they had to become public. They had to shed their kind of secretive rituals and become public. And so by the end, about a decade after their founding, they decided to try and start organizing workers everywhere across the United States. And they grew very rapidly. And they grew rapidly in the late 1870s and early 1880s, really, I think, for two reasons. One is that they were advocates of some of the most important and compelling issues for the working class. In particular, they were leaders in the fight for a maximum hours legislation, also sometimes known as the 8 hours movement. And there, I think I have an image here of the famous slogan of the 8 hours movement, which was 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. You often found this engraving or similar kinds of engravings with this slogan in Knight speeches or in pamphlets and literature. And as we'll see in a minute, they were committed to the 8 hours movement, not just as a way of regulating wage labor, but because they thought that actually leisure was an essential component. Leisure for everyone was an essential component of universal human freedom. of a truly emancipated economy. So how they were a part of that movement is different from how others were a part of it. So one reason that they started to grow in the early 1880s was because they started to champion very publicly causes that were important to workers. But the other reason was that they participated in and helped coordinate a few very well-known and successful strikes in the early 1880s. And at that period, workers were often losing strikes, not winning them, often because of the violence committed against them and the legal obstacles and other constraints. But the Knights, in part because they could get other workers out in sympathy with the strikers, were able to win a few, especially some well-known ones on the railroads. And all of the sudden, tens of thousands of workers flocked to the Knights of Labor, to the point where by 1886, which is when membership peaked, they had about 750,000 formal members and a couple 100,000 other members. So about 1 million Knights of Labor at the peak in 1886. And this included white male shoemakers in the north, black cane workers in the south, Mexican workers in the Southwest, and all kinds of industrial and craft workers across the US. And it was an important and distinguishing feature of the Knights of Labor that they were committed to including all workers, not just craft workers, in a single union. So they were really the first to try and attempt a kind of industrial unionism where unskilled workers were in the same union as craft workers. Now, 1886 was the peak for the Knights of Labor for a couple of reasons. Can't go into all the details, but one important reason was that 1886 was the year of the Haymarket Rebellion, of which they were part, and that was a very controversial event in labor history. It was also the year when they decided to make a major push in the South to organize black workers. And I think I have an image actually from their convention, the 1886 National Convention, which they held in Richmond, Virginia, to kind of have a show of strength in the South. And what it's an image of is Frank Farrell, a black Knight of Labor, introducing Terence Powderly, the head or the Grand Master Workman of the Knights of Labor, at the National Convention. And so they wanted to make a very public showing of sort of transracial worker organizing and solidarity. But this was also the year when repression against the Knights got turned up, and when the somewhat more conservative and somewhat more racist craft unions that were around the kind of fledgling American Federation of Labor started to begin to leave the Knights of Labor. They didn't want to be part of this mass industrial kind of union effort. And I should add that it wasn't just organizing transracially, but it was it was the most inclusive labor movement of women as well. I think they're the first major national organization of labor that inscribed equal pay for equal work into its central list of demands or its platform. But after 1886, especially with the departure of the better organized craft unions, the Knights of Labor started to decline. And by the turn of the century, they numbered in the tens of thousands again. So that's the history of the Knights of Labor. And that's kind of basically who they were. And it should be said, before they collapsed, they counted among them some of the most important and radical labor organizers and activists of the 19th century, like Albert Parsons or Big Bill Haywood, Mother Jones. So a lot of the luminaries that we think of as the major figures of the radical left. And I think it's really tied to this vision of worker self-emancipation. So that's who the Knights were. So what is it in particular that they believed? And I think the way to think about it, why they were able to inspire workers and create this really radical mass movement of workers on a scale that whose sort of breadth and radicalism wouldn't be matched for many decades in the United States. I think the way to understand it is to think about how they developed an argument against wage labor and for cooperative production or worker controlled production. And the way they developed this argument was by arguing that the central site of unfreedom in a modern capitalist society was the workplace. And I think I have a quotation here of in which this is from the Journal of United Labor, which was the national journal of the Knights of Labor, in which one of the authors is an anonymous one. And I should say all of the quotations that I'm going to read, they are characteristic ones. So they're not sort of unusual. They represent patterns of thought you can find all over their speeches and documents and public writings and books and so on. So this quotation says, "Is there a workshop where obedience is not demanded, not to the difficulties or qualities of the labor to be performed, but to the caprice of he who pays the wages of his servants?" So the argument they're making, and I'll say in a minute sort of how this is drawing on a long tradition of thinking, was that wage labor is not free labor. And it's not free labor because workers are dependent upon their employers for a job and they're subject to his commands. So another way of putting it is that workers are not under their own power. They're not controlling their own activity when they're at work. Instead, they are subject to the arbitrary power of the employer. And while that doesn't make them slaves in the form of chattel slavery, it's still a form of subjection or servitude, and therefore unfree. So this is how they started. And they made this experience of unfreedom the kind of central fact and experience that they used to articulate what therefore everyone had in common, which was overcoming this condition of subjection, regardless of all of the other kind of diverse religious and racial and ethnic interests and identities that they happened to have. So because of this dependence, they then argued the next step in the basic structure of their view was to say that this is incompatible with the basic Republican commitments of American society. So the second quotation I have here is from George McNeil, who was a kind of leading journalist and propagandist for the Knights, in which he says, "There is an inevitable and irresistible conflict between the wage system of labor and the Republican system of government." Now, the first thing to notice about this quotation is that McNeil is very consciously citing the same language of freedom that had been bubbling around the lead up to the Civil War, and was part of the ideological ferment of the post-Civil War period. When he says there's an irresistible conflict, he's directly and quietly quoting, I believe it's Seward, who said that there is an irresistible conflict between slavery and the American Republic. And what McNeil is saying is that although, and this is what all the Knights believed, although chattel slavery had been abolished, servitude had not. Unfreedom had not been fully overcome. Another way of saying it, I don't have the quotation here, was someone who said, something of slavery still remains, something of freedom is yet to come. And so they're very consciously seeing themselves as continuous with a project of transforming the organization of work. And this is especially vivid in this next quotation, where you see, having then said that there's this irresistible conflict between wage labor and Republican system of government, they said we have to take the ideal of self-government as it exists in our politics and apply it to the rest of our life, especially the economy. So Ira Stewart, who was the son of an abolitionist and one of the leading voices of the 8 Hours movement after the Civil War, says this: a republicanization of labor as well as a republicanization of government is the key to overcoming this conflict. So it's a very radical. The point is to kind of go to the root of unfreedom in the modern economy, and they find it in the republicanizing of labor. But what does that mean? There were many proposals for labor reform at the time. Some involved just sort of health and safety legislation or indemnity legislation or maximum hours legislation. But for the Knights, the key was to transform the organization of work itself. And this is especially vivid in this next quotation, which comes again from George McNeil, but it's kind of repeated as kind of potboiler across a lot of Knights' writings, which he says the key is to abolish as rapidly as possible the wage system, substituting cooperation therefore. And so you see the point is not just to regulate wage labor, but to abolish it, to get rid of it. And when they talked about cooperation, what they meant was creating workers or producers cooperatives. And the idea of these producers of cooperatives was that they would eliminate the distinction between workers and employers, or labor and capital, as they sometimes put it, and instead have workers control and manage the workplace itself. So the image of republicanizing labor, or what they had in mind in republicanizing labor, was taking the idea of self-government and applying it to the economic sphere, and in particular, the workplace. And that's how workers could finally enjoy freedom and eliminate the subjection and dependence that they experienced by being forced to work for some employer or another and simply take commands or obey commands and have to live under that particular employer's will. So this is the basic image they have of freedom, was to say that the way to emancipate workers from this new form of subjection was to eliminate the boss, right, and give workers control over their workplace. Now, it's important to note that they saw this as a vision of emancipation, not just because it was a way that workers could be free in and through work, but also because they thought that cooperative production was the key to allowing workers to be freed from work. And it's here their vision of this cooperative Commonwealth, as they sometimes put it, was connected then to their ideas about leisure, because they thought that only when workers control and manage the workplace itself will they be able to really impose 8 hours as the maximum workday across the entire economy. But also because only then will they be able to take home an adequate share of what they produce, that they can live off what they produce in 8 hours and enjoy the rest of the time themselves. So there's a very nice quotation from the preamble to the Constitution of the Knights of Labor, when they say, "Our aim is to secure to the workers the full enjoyment of the wealth they create, sufficient leisure in which to develop their intellectual, moral, and social faculties." So the point was that workers can only be fully emancipated and have the real opportunities to develop their capacities for human flourishing, not just by being self-governing in the workplace, but being freed from the persistent overwork that the wage system tends to produce. And they could only do that if they really controlled the workplace and therefore determined, for instance, who would enjoy the benefits of new technologies. And let's say the most utopian versions of this argument by some knights was that they thought that having produced 8 hours, you could over time use technology to reduce the hours of necessary labor to 6 and even 4. So that's the vision that the Knights of Labor had, and they promoted it heavily. I mean, it has to be said that these quotations I've taken were the kinds of things that any knight would have read in any journal or heard in any of the extensive speaker circuit they had. So it was the leading set of ideas that they used to kind of inspire and organize workers to join in this single radical political organization of labor. So that's their kind of basic ideas. And you can see how the kind of beating heart of it is a certain way of thinking about freedom, of criticizing subjection in this economy and imagining one in which everyone enjoys freedom in and from work. Now, I want to just finish by saying sort of one final thing about what all this language of republicanizing or republicanism is. What are they talking about? And then conclude with kind of a following thought for us. So the reason you see this term republicanism showing up in what they say is that the Knights were actually drawing on a long tradition of thinking about freedom and its relationship to labor that is called republican because it can trace its origins back to the classical republics, the ancient republics. And in particular to the idea that the fundamental distinction in society was between those who were free and those who were slave. Those who were free were those who were under their own power, and those who were slaves or subject were under the power of someone else. They were a dependent class. They weren't under their own power. They were under the arbitrary power of another person or set of people. Now, this basic idea, this basic distinction, this way of thinking about freedom can sound like it's naturally suited to the critique of slavery. But in the classical republics, it wasn't. In fact, the opposite was true. The kind of predominant view was that the freedom of some presupposed the servitude or subjection of others, because it was the work of that slave class that created the material conditions for the leisure and independence of those who at least didn't have to perform excessive amounts of work, and in reality would ideally not have to perform any work at all. So the freedom of some classically presupposed the unfreedom of others. And then this basic idea of freedom as being under your own power or self-governing is rehabilitated in the early modern period originally in arguments against absolute monarchy and colonial government. So for instance, it's one of the fighting terms used in the American Revolution against the arbitrary power of colonial British governors. But what happens is that originally this Republican idea of freedom is used to criticize political slavery, but not really engage with the fundamental question of whether there has to be a dependent class of workers or not. And it's really the 19th century when this question is faced squarely. And I have to say that this idea of that Republican liberty maybe could be universalized appears throughout Europe. It's not just an American vernacular, but it has a particular valence in the US because it's preceded by, or it's precipitated by first the engagement with actual chattel slavery. And what you get there is, on the one hand, some of the defenders of slavery think they're the classical Republicans. They're like, no, we are the ones who are really devoted to liberty because we understand there has to be a slave class making our freedom possible. But in response, a number of figures, especially these sort of radical worker intellectuals who were around the first political organizations of workers, starting in the 1820s and 30s, and then culminating in the Knights of Labor, start to invert the argument. They say, no, actually the freedom of some presupposes the freedom of all, because in a society based on slavery or any form of subject labor, people come to think of their freedom as the power to dominate others, and they develop habits of domination and seek to dominate others and to institute that domination, and never in fact interact with others as equals whose freedom is as much a condition of their own freedom as theirs is for others. And so what's unique and distinctive about this labor Republican idea is that once we start thinking about the organization of work, the question of how to universalize freedom, how to make freedom something that everyone enjoys and nobody enjoys until everyone enjoys it, or really possesses that freedom, becomes the kind of becomes the idea that motivates the critique not just of slavery, although importantly that, and almost all of these worker intellectuals were profound critics of slavery. But once it's replaced, they come to ask questions about whether other forms of dependent labor also have to be overcome. And so the Knights of Labor really sit at the end of this long tradition of asking the question, what would it mean to universalize liberty? And why is that centrally a question of how we organize human laboring activity together and collectively? So that's who the Knights of Labor are, and how their language of freedom isn't just sort of invented ex nihilo, but actually stands at the end of a long and important development in modern thinking about freedom and the economy. And so I just wanted to conclude with this sort of thought for us today, which is that one thing that I think is so compelling and inspiring about the Knights of Labor and what's potentially fertile for the left today is not just that they're able to, for a time, unify large segments of workers, skilled and unskilled, men, women, people of various races and ethnicities, in a single political organization of workers, but that they're able to do so by arguing that it's up to workers to emancipate themselves from their own subjection. So they found a way of talking about unfreedom in the economy without viewing workers as abject victims, and without seeing the point of political organization as somehow advocacy for victims who can't act themselves. Instead, they had the opposite, quite demanding view, which is that this sort of future cooperative Commonwealth had to be realized through the self-organization of workers acting on their own behalf. And I think it is natural to think that way if you think that the point of freedom is to treat everyone as having the capacity for self-government and for ruling their own lives, and for demanding that freedom for themselves. And I think that that particular thought is a really important one for us to hold on to when we think about left-wing politics and freedom, that what was really compelling and important about the Knights of Labor was not just that they were able to criticize the economy from the standpoint of freedom, or come up with a social vision of what an emancipated economy would look like, what it would look like to be free in work and from work, but also that really importantly, the politics of freedom, of this freedom, was quite demanding, that it actually really hinged on viewing workers as able to organize themselves as a collective agent that saw its own emancipation through its own efforts. And so that's I think, one of the most inspiring and important things about them that I think we can learn from today. So that's the Knights of Labor, and I'm interested to hear what anybody out there has to say.
Thank you, Alex. That was really good. That was really interesting. So, my bias is towards kind of steering the conversation to some of those more philosophical topics about how to think about freedom, and how the Knights of Labor view kind of fits into that tradition and is relevant to some of those debates today. And I definitely do want to get to that. But I saw in the chat somebody was asking about the relationship between the Knights of Labor and later radical labor organizing, like they mentioned the IWW in particular. And I guess maybe one way to kind of jump into that is say that, my understanding is that the Knights ended up being really brutally destroyed, right, by both the federal government and employer thugs. And so maybe if you want to speak on that for a minute, you could then kind of tie it into these later labor radicals, who stood for similar ideals.
I mean, why the sorry, I'm getting the sun right through my window. It's like a Klieg light. So why the Knights of Labor collapsed is a complicated question, and I think we cannot actually lay all the blame on the violent repression that they experienced, but it is important to name that. People often kind of forget, or it's sort of just a small number of people who have this kind of interest in violent labor repression. But American labor history is one of the most violent of labor histories among the sort of major industrial capitalist countries. And there was just extensive, especially beginning in the 1870s, extensive use of federal troops, of local police, of vigilantes to just violently repress labor organizing, often quite peaceful. In fact, the violence attracted the attention of European socialists who used it to, like Wilhelm Liebknecht uses it to, no, I think it's Karl Liebknecht who uses it to point out, in America you have democracy, and yet it's one of the most violently repressive of class politics, far more violent, he said, than even his own experience. So the Knights experience it quite violently. I mean, there's a famous case where in 1887, where they go down to Louisiana and they try to organize black cane workers. And they organized between 5,000 and 10,000 black cane workers and have this massive strike. And there's just an absolutely awful slaughter of the workers and some of the Knights in this strike. And it's repeated everywhere. And somewhat indiscriminately. I mean, the violence that we sometimes think is purely kind of racial violence of white people against black people. At that time, it was committed against any group of workers, really, no matter what their skin color was, who sought to assert their collective power. 1877, 1886, 1892, 1894, there's these massive strikes, and the troops come in and repress them. And this is certainly an objective limit to what the Knights were able to do. They didn't have a full answer to that repression. I'll say if they made a significant political mistake, I think it was that they grew very quickly and didn't quite adapt to the radicalism of their own membership. I'd say, in a way, their own members were, on the whole, more radical, more ready to engage in mass strikes than the leadership were. And this meant that the leadership was a bit out of step with the views and attitudes of this massive influx of new members. And the massive influx of new members always poses a difficulty and a challenge for a political organization. But it's got to be one that any organization that seeks to be universalistic and appeal to almost everyone has to be prepared for. So I think we can't let the Knights off the hook entirely. But the amounts of vigilante violence alone, the assassination of union organizers everywhere, or the violence committed against them is quite extraordinary. So, yeah.
Yeah. So there's this violent repression. There were political mistakes that were committed by the Knights themselves, or certainly not being sure how to handle the moment and the rapid expansion. And then the Knights themselves were repressed, but it wasn't too much later historically that you start to get these kind of successor movements like the Wobblies that had some of the same ideas about what's now called industrial unionism. Not trying to just organize narrow craft unions. Like how much of a direct influence was there?
So I think the direct influence is really underappreciated. I mean, in the basic kind of views about mass industrial solidarity, right down to the slogan, right down to really fundamentally important figures. The Western Federation of Miners, out of which grow the kind of the Wobblies, they grow out of the kind of, in part, the kind of rump elements of the Knights as they decay. And there's all kinds of sort of, many of so people often observe that the Wobblies had this great radical kind of musical tradition. Actually, many of those songs were invented during the Knights of Labor period by Knights, who then carried them into the Wobblies or their kind of interior predecessor organizations. So this kind of massive, all-inclusive political organization of workers that created its own worker counterculture based on a shared fundamental interest of all workers in emancipation through their own self-organization, is absolutely continuous with the Wobblies. And you can really trace particular individuals as they move from early experiences with the Knights through sort of either radical miners, railroad workers, or elsewhere, and then into things like the Wobblies and socialist politics. And many Knights were also members of either Socialist Party or socialist organizations. The Knights helped sponsor speaking tour of various socialists. They had reading groups that included like August Bebel and Marx, reading libraries that they had around the country. And many of the same kind of books that were read and much of the same literature then you find in the kind of public and educational culture of Wobblies. So yes, I think there's a very, as far as I know, there's only one systematic attempt to actually trace these connections by an old historian called Robert Weir, who wrote a book about the Knights of Labor and then showed a bit how this stuff traces into the Wobblies. I'd say the major, and let's say also the major open question for the Knights as well as for the Wobblies was how to or whether to participate in politics, because they weren't in fact a political party, nor were the Wobblies, and they were highly suspicious of participation in the state, and were in some ways deeply committed to a kind of self-reliant view that they wanted the state mainly to stay out of their lives. Saw the state in a fairly hostile, repressive form, and were therefore very suspicious of participation in things in mainstream political parties, although the Knights were quite committed to promoting and advocating for certain kinds of legislation. So there's a lot in the political culture, educational daily culture, as well as in the kind of basic ideas of the two organizations that are quite continuous.
Yeah. So I think in that answer, you may have partially answered something else that was being asked about in the chat, which was about influence from Karl Marx on this, right? Which would certainly go through the intermediary of some of those, German socialists doing speaking tours you were talking about. Although I think my suspicion, right, is that shouldn't be overstated, because a lot of these connections, right, between Republican ideas about freedom and wage labor and capitalism, are certainly connections that are being made by thinkers like Marx, but they're also things that emerge very naturally out of the political situation in the United States.
So that's a really important question. And I talked a bit about the relationship between, say, the Knights of Labor and labor republicanism and Marx in the conclusion of my book. But part of the thing to remember, and part of the reason I think this history is so important, is that Marx, there was nothing unique about Marx when it came to the criticism of wage labor. And that actually what makes Marx Marx is not that he's a socialist or communist, nor that he's a critic of wage labor. And the vision of the Knights of Labor did not draw very much on Marx, actually. Partially because there wasn't that much in English, and it was a primarily English-speaking and some French sources, but because also they drew on two sets of ideas that were just much more common, sort of widely circulating ways of thinking about capitalism and socialism. One was, as I said, just this idea of freedom. You didn't have to read Marx to care about freedom. It was part of the organic language of the American Revolution. It was taken to be, it was part of the public culture in the United States and also in Europe, that in these democratic republics, everybody, even these sort of among liberals, that everyone deserved a kind of freedom. And then to have just the empirical experience of being unfree at work. So it was very natural for people to argue that the problem was a kind of unfreedom. And the second thing is that there was a wide variety of socialist and anarchist views about how to replace wage labor. And so this idea of cooperative production was actually a very widespread idea. And it grows out of some of the early socialism, connected with Owen and Fourier, but kind of advances past them. Because the really important thing for the Knights of Labor was that they didn't think that socialism had any future as the attempt to just kind of create these little isolated self-sufficient communities. What real social republicanism or labor republicanism meant, what cooperation could mean as a way of transforming the whole economy, had to be interlocking cooperatives on a national scale, supported by the state. So they wanted, nationalization of utilities and roads and things like that. And they wanted a favorable monetary policy that made it possible for workers to accumulate capital so they could start these cooperatives. And they wanted certain kinds of regulation of wages so that capitalists couldn't outcompete them. So the state's there, and they saw that political control of the state was necessary. Although, again, primarily, they're sort of most conscious of it as primarily as the need to restrain its repressive hand, rather than through an extensive state-managed political economy. Because their idea of freedom is really one in which workers organize and manage their activity themselves. And so they were suspicious about sort of excessive bureaucratic management. And I think here you do see a real distinction with Marx, really in two ways. One is that Marx thought that seizure of the state was a sine qua non for socialist transformation of the economy, and that you needed it to expropriate property from the owners of capital. And the Knights of Labor never committed themselves to that view so thoroughly. And you also, I think Marx thought real emancipation required a more thoroughgoing elimination of the market. Whereas the Knights of Labor vision of these producer cooperatives are still that they're kind of selling products that they produce on a market with others. Whereas I think the Marxian view is not just you need sort of a more thoroughgoing seizure of the state and public management of the economy, but because what a kind of planned economy looks like wasn't really consistent with attempting to make profits by selling commodities on the market. So, and those are important things to think about and struggle with, about how far you need to go. But the reason it's important to highlight those things, I think, is both to understand what I think is some of the particularities of the Marxist critique of capitalism, and then also to understand how broad and how deep the arguments for freedom from the strictures of capitalist work were. You didn't need Marx to tell you that it was unfree, and you didn't need that kind of language. And I think that helps us understand what we might think you do need Marx for. But
Yeah.
these guys
Yeah.
were. I should just add one little historical note, which is that one of Marx's closest correspondents in the U.S. was in the Knights of Labor, and many of them were in the International Working Men's Association. His name was Theodore Kuno, and he was the chief statistician of the Knights. So he was, and Engels actually, I think, has some nice things to say about the Knights. But it was natural for people in the Knights to see a connection with the communist movement and with Marx, but it wasn't sort of specially connected to that.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I do want to explore some of what you touched on there about capitalism and freedom, but I also want to back up since something that you mentioned, you talk, and we've mentioned a couple times in the Q&A. But I just kind of want to underline, just in case anybody's watching, who's not that familiar with it, is this crucially historically important distinction about craft unionism and industrial unionism, which I think even ties into things like why leftists have supported ideas in different contexts, like bargaining in entire sectors. Once you've actually got collective bargaining up and running. I was wondering if you could speak on that for a minute.
Right. So I mean so craft unions were usually unions of particular skilled workers in a particular trade who only allowed other workers with the same skills or of the same status in the union, and who understood their actual politics were quite varied, but who did not want to organize together with the large number of industrial unskilled workers, people in switchmen on the railroads, miners down in the mines, the lowest skilled occupations in meat packing and in textiles and in agriculture. So they thought that including those workers didn't share the same interests, that those workers couldn't be counted on because they tended to move around and didn't have the same commitment to the union. And so they wanted to organize unions on a craft basis, and to therefore organize either with bargain either with particular employers or particular groups of employers. Whereas the industrial union idea thought that all workers shared fundamentally the same interest, and that they should all be organized in the same union, irrespective of craft or skill level. And the Knights of Labor were really the first such political organization of workers on an industrial basis. And I think an important feature of it was not just that that unskilled wage workers were in the same union as skilled trade, as the skilled trades, but that the expectations of solidarity were different as well. That it was expected that anyone anywhere in the union, any set of workers anywhere, would be ready to support any other set of workers in their particular labor struggles. And this is one reason why the Knights, when they were carrying off some effective strikes, were effective and attractive, was that they could, if railroad workers somewhere were striking, all the other Knights in all of the other trades, whether they were shoemakers or brewers, would also walk out and support. And this was a much more powerful way of exercising power as workers rather than as shoemakers or as cigar rollers or as, I think Gompers was originally a cigar roller. Gompers was the head of the AFL, which was organized on this craft union basis. So that's the really important feature of industrial unionism. It's not just that everyone's organized in the same union, but the expectations of sympathy and solidarity are much broader because the understanding of where class power lies is different. And they seek to organize and bargain with either entire sectors, like on an industrial basis, or some were committed to the idea of the general strike. That was most famously the weapon that the Wobblies thought, the industrial workers of the world thought could be used to advance the interests of workers when they're organized in one big union. So that's an important distinction, and I think today we would include a lot of workers in places like Walmart, Amazon warehouses, fast food industry as the kind of workers who wouldn't want to organize on an industrial basis together with everyone else in a single union, because they are stronger when they have the support of all other workers. And they all have the same shared interest in transforming basic labor relations.
Yeah. And I think talking about different groups of workers having shared interests gets us to a question that was asked in the chat about the Knights' record on race and some of the ambiguities about that. They mentioned organizing across racial lines, but also having segregated locals, and how that relates to what you're talking about, right? Like, in other words, that certainly one of the through lines for really almost any kind of history of either labor organizing or political radicalism and socialism in the United States is how to think about interracial working class solidarity and how that relates to maybe more specific questions about the oppression, in particular, of Black people in the United States.
Good. So that's a good question. I think the way to think about the Knights is this. They were absolutely the worst when it came to the Chinese. So the one place where there's not much ambiguity in the kind of racism of their policies was that they were committed to Chinese exclusion, and officially didn't want Chinese members. On that count, they were pretty much no different from any other organization in the 19th century. In fact, there were many Black people who supported Chinese exclusion in the late 19th century. Booker T. Washington supports it. Also supports other kinds of immigration controls for some interesting, complicated reasons we don't have time for. But I think if we want to talk about kind of the biggest race problem, so to speak, for the Knights, it was there. And they had two reasons they gave for wanting to exclude the Chinese. One was practical. They didn't know how to organize them because they didn't speak Chinese. And they thought they were unorganizable on that basis. And so they felt they were just used as basically strike breakers and low wage, sort of the equivalent of kind of peon or prison labor to drive down wages. And they could, because of that, they thought they just couldn't organize them, so they wanted them excluded. But that was linked to this kind of deeper, more directly racist thought that part of the reason the Chinese were unorganizable wasn't just the linguistic barrier or the fact that they lived in neighborhoods that other Knights didn't, and the Knights didn't know how to make social contact with them. But there was something distinctive about the Chinese, that they were just willing to accept their subjection. I mean, the labor conditions for the Chinese at this time were especially unfree, even for the time. Some worked under actual legal relations that were essentially slavery and were in effect slave-like. But the Knights thought, because they never saw Chinese resisting this, although they did, but they were unaware, didn't have enough contact, thought that it was because the Chinese didn't care for freedom. They didn't want freedom. And this is a kind of old prejudice about certain groups that you see, sort of the old idea of like Oriental despotism, that the people just accept their subjection. So this was, I think, where the kind of race problem was most vivid for the Knights. It's a more complicated story when it comes to organizing Black workers in the South. So it is true that there were some segregated locals, and this was partially a concession to some racist white locals. But at the same time, there were many integrated locals, and the Knights were committed to, and particularly leadership wanted to, over time, overcome that segregation. And they were committed. It's one of the reasons that they were committed to they tried to make a big push in '86 to organize workers into large district assemblies in the South, together with white workers. Why they had white organizers who were going into areas where there were Black workers trying to organize them. And especially compared with the time and many labor movements afterwards, they were remarkably willing to commit themselves to legal and social equality. So I think that, they faced the problem any organization trying to organize a majority of people for a common cause faced, which was, were they willing to include within their ranks groups of people who were racist? And they did. There's little evidence besides in some places segregated locals that these people were able to determine anything about the major policy of the Knights. And in fact, in some cases, especially after 1886, when they started to make this big drive into the South, some of the white workers of the South, especially the more conservative ones who were connected to the AFL, left because they couldn't tolerate the racial solidarity that was developing at the time. They particularly loathed that you found white knights drinking beers together with black knight workers and things like that. So it's sometimes said that one of the reasons the Knights declined was that it fractured in the South because white workers wouldn't accept that. I don't think that's true. I think it had to do more with other causes. And as I say, I think the bigger Achilles heel racially was their view of the Chinese, and in some cases, certain Southern and Eastern Europeans, actually, who they also saw a bit like the Chinese. But I should say one thing about that, which is I think that we can't so easily then see this all as evidence that the problem was just a kind of generic ambient racism. I think there is a deeper challenge in the Knights of Labor view and really any politics that's committed to self-emancipation, which is that, and I did write about some of this in the book, because I think actually if we really want to think about what was particularly a problem for the Knights, it's that if you are committed to the idea that it's up to the oppressed to emancipate themselves, then you come to demand things of those workers or of that oppressed group. You expect them to engage in sometimes quite heroic forms of organizing and resistance because you think they're capable of doing it. It's up to them to do it, and they've got to do it for themselves because no one can do it for them. But because that politics of emancipation is so demanding, and it's demanding precisely in conditions where you can expect repression and violence and loss, you come to see that some people are more immediately willing to sign up than others. And when certain groups don't immediately respond to the call, you start to think the problem isn't with your ideas or with your failure to organize them, but with them. They lack the virtue, they lack the love of liberty that you are committed to. And I think there's these sort of steps by which, and you see it in some of the writing of the Knights, when they start saying things like, well, the Chinese just accept their Unfreedom, that you start to think, well, the reason certain groups are just not willing to make the same sacrifice is because of some ethnic characteristic they have. Their unwillingness to join the politics of emancipation is because, well, there's certain groups who just are less committed to or unwilling to make the sacrifices that the demand for freedom requires. And I think resisting that step and in somehow finding a way to both expect people to undertake quite heroic efforts to emancipate themselves, while then finding a way to understand why it is that some groups are not doing it. That, I think, is a real challenge for the politics of self-emancipation, and I think explains some of the particular racial problems that the Knights faced.
Yeah, and probably comes up in a lot of other contexts too. As you're saying that, it's kind of
I think it's a lesson for us too.
Tendencies that we see today by some leftists to broadly write off entire portions of the population that maybe have bad culture war attitudes or in other ways, might currently not being on our side, and get frustrated with them for not having seen the light yet in ways that might be counterproductive.
That's to see that as our failure, right? That's our failure.
Right, exactly. Right. It's like that.
The working class over,
Yeah, I got to dissolve in the people and elect in another, right? That it's our job to convince people. So I guess since we're about at 7, and I don't want to take up too much of your time, and I've got to go in a little bit. Got to the premiere of the next episode of my podcast is coming right up at 7:30. So I want to jet in a few minutes, but I did want, if I can hold you for a couple more minutes, I did want
Sure.
to kind of pivot back to the larger questions that you're using to frame your talk, about how to think about freedom and this sort of broad philosophical difference people like Isaiah Berlin talk about between sort of thinking about freedom in the way libertarians do, as non-interference, and freedom in this Republican sense as non-domination, right? I mean, that's maybe a simplification, but I mean, that gets the basic idea across. And in some ways, I think maybe the last time that the American left like did a pretty good job of like really seizing the ground of the rhetoric of freedom was maybe the civil rights movement, right? You know, I'm thinking about like the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. Although you also saw at the same time, right, there's like the Barry Goldwater campaign, which is, you know, weaponizing the opposite idea about freedom. And I'm wondering if you maybe would like to kind of wrap this up, right? You know, could talk a little bit about what we can do now to sort of reclaim some of that ground, and maybe even relate it to one of the articles. Now, if this is something that happened during the Democratic primary, so of course I feel like I'm referencing events from the Ford administration at this point. You know, like that seems like so long ago. You know, that several months to a year ago. But there was a point during the Democratic primary when centrists were getting mad at Bernie Sanders for using the phrase wage slavery, which he wrote about for Jacobin. And this kind of gets back to this question, right? You know, about because I think what Bernie, you know, was doing there, right? You know, is trying to reclaim some of this language of freedom, which, no matter how you slice it, is always going to be an incredibly important thing in American political culture. So it seems like that's something that we really need to find a way to reclaim.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that the argument that wage labor is a form of wage slavery is a very old and venerable argument in American politics. And it was almost never a racist argument. There was a strand of argument from some white workers that would say wage labor is wage slavery, and what's wrong with that is not that it's slavery, but that you're doing to white people what you should only be allowed to do with black people. That was a minority view. It wasn't the thrust of the argument against wage slavery. Instead, it was actually quite the opposite. It was much of what I discussed in my opening presentation, which is that what the contest over slavery awoke was the question of what it really means to be free in the economy, and whether wage labor is really a form of free labor or not. And so the contest over slavery had the potential to be quite radical, because it allowed people to say, well, actually, any condition of subjection to a boss, being forced to go find a job with some employer or another, and then accept their commands, whatever they are, is not chattel slavery, but it's still unfree. And that's why wage slavery deserves the name wage slavery, and everyone should be emancipated from it. And that was a view that the Knights of Labor used the term wage slavery. They often had these articles comparing wage slavery and chattel slavery. And you can trace it up through the Wobblies and socialists and communists, and it was a widespread language. And in a way, I kind of think, if anything, Bernie used to be much more comfortable with that language in the 70s and 80s than he has been recently. The point of my article is really to say we need more of this, not less, because it's so sotto voce, it's so underneath the idea. And that the major theme of the campaign was in a way very welfarist. It was sort of, we need to give everyone healthcare because people shouldn't have to suffer. And of course, everyone should have healthcare. But the major reason for universal health insurance is emancipation, actually, to be free from those concerns, from the demands, from those basic economic concerns, so that you can go and pursue your projects, and that you don't have to stay in a job just for the healthcare. It just gives employers more power. Sorry?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are people who stay in bad marriages because they don't want to lose spousal health care.
I mean, there's just so much of this, right? I really think that a return to that idea of republicanizing labor, self-government and work, and freeing ourselves from the economy and also in the economy is the way to go. I should, in this context, then plug an article I recently wrote with Corey Robin about reclaiming freedom, which takes a more direct contemporary approach than this presentation here, in which we talk about this and why it makes sense to start with the economy and the discipline organized against people at work and through market mechanisms, and why that can be a real foundation for rethinking the kind of ideas of the left. And we also kind of try to trace it. Actually, you mentioned Barry Goldwater, but we try to trace actually the kind of right-wing counter-revolution to an earlier period, which is Hayek and the kind of early neoliberal, what's become known as the neoliberal response to the welfare state, and how the discipline of the market and the coercion of the workplace gets renamed as freedom. And so being forced to be subject to the discipline of the market somehow gets renamed as freedom rather than being emancipated from it. So I think these are ideas it's quite important for us to kind of really rethink, and that I think could also give a kind of coherence to a lot of the different issues that the left discusses, but to my mind at least still doesn't have a name for and an organizing set of ideas for. There are a lot of different campaigns and interests, from how to think about energy, how to think about police and prisons, to how to think about healthcare. And there are a lot of positions and arguments over positions, but the systematic connections among them, I think, are the kinds of things that are still missing as the left tries to grow and rethink itself, given the kind of the defeats that the left experienced by the end of the 20th century.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was really good. So you have been watching Alex Gourevitch. He's the author of quite a few Jacobin articles, including the one most relevant to this talk, which is called Our Forgotten Labor Revolution. He's also the author of a book called From Slavery to the Cooperative Commonwealth, Labor and Republican Liberty in the 19th Century. Should check out all of his stuff. Should remember to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Also, just as a reminder, we've got coming up on Wednesday, we've got a debate between Lee Phillips and Christian Prente about nuclear energy. Should check that out. On Friday, there's Richard Seymour talking about the monstrous legacy of Winston Churchill. And on Saturdays, of course, there's the regular weekends show where the guest this week is going to be Matt Karp, talking about the defeat of Bernie's political revolution and where they can go from there. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.